You are listening to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. My name's Ryan Evans. I'm the founder of War on the Rocks. In this episode, I sat down with General David Allvin. General Allvin became the 23rd Chief of Staff of the Air Force in November of last year. I hope you enjoy listening to this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it. So what inspired you to join the Air Force?
First of all, let me say thanks very much for having me on the podcast. I have been a pretty avid follower of specifically some of the Ukrainian content, but it is, as it's described, a great venue just to sit and listen to thought leaders. So I found myself a little bit intimidated and impressed for being asked to be on here. So thank you very much, Ryan, for having me on. Well, I'm the eighth of 9 kids, and my dad was he served in World War II in the Air Force, or in the Navy, and then in Korea in the Air Force, but was not a career guy. But he was always a patriot, and he always took me to air shows, and so I always enjoyed flying. And the idea of those two things coming together, that's what really directed me towards applying to the Air Force Academy and wanting to come into the Air Force. As most people in my position would say, I never imagined myself being here 4 decades later.
There is something magical about being a kid at an air show. I think a lot of people have those memories, and there's something pretty awe-inspiring about it. What's the most vivid memory you have of being at an air show when you were a kid?
2, really. The one was I grew up very young age in Tucson, Arizona. And so the Pima Air Museum was nearby there, but the air show out at Davis-Monthan was impressive to me in 2 ways. One, the big airplane, getting to walk inside of that thing, and it's even bigger when you're a little kid. But looking at the size of that and then trying to imagine that thing actually flying was almost incomprehensible. And then just the raw power and sound and speed of watching the Thunderbirds. Those sort of things, they do inspire you because you picture yourself and say, could I be in the front of that doing that? And I think that's one of the things that inspired me as a kid.
You went to the Air Force Academy. Who was your favorite professor or instructor there?
I wish I could say by name the instructor, but if you saw my transcript, it was nothing really to scream about. I would say my favorite officer there, though, was my air officer commanding the second 2 years that I was there, my junior and senior year. And his name was Major Bill Crow. I admired him because he gave me a chance. I wasn't necessarily the most stellar cadet, but he saw something in me and gave me an opportunity to lead, and I became a cadet squadron commander. And I thought, I don't know, he saw something in me I didn't see in myself necessarily. And because he did that for me, it lit a fire for me, and it also made me understand that there are other people out who are unpolished diamonds you need to look out for. So,
yeah, I think that's a real special insight. Sometimes you need the right leader to draw something out of yourself that you didn't know you had. Who is your best, speaking of that, your best boss that you had after the academy, but before you became a general officer?
Well, before I became a general officer, I was going to jump right in with the one as a general officer. But before I became a general officer, I would say that it was probably the squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel McKinney, at McCord Air Force Base, where I was flying C-141s in the early 90s. It was interesting because he's also the one whose advice I defied. Interestingly enough, I had just come from Europe. I had spent my first assignment at Ramstein and was there when the wall came down, which was fascinating. But in 1990, I was restationed to McCord Air Force Base flying C-141s. And this was right as Desert Shield, Desert Storm was kicking off. And he had the trust and confidence in me to put me in leadership positions as an aircraft commander and in the squadron very early. And he had great nudges left and right where I didn't realize I was being guided and I thought I was doing it myself. Looking back on that, though, he was very understanding. And as a young captain, I thought that his leadership was a deft touch. It didn't have to overpower you, but you saw the wisdom in what he was doing maybe a few weeks after he did it. I think that's something special as well.
You know, you mentioned there when the wall fell. So very early in your career, you were faced off against one sort of military juggernaut opponent, and now we're dealing with a rising China, which we'll talk more about later in the episode. But, you know, as you think about that history and these experiences in your career, what do you think are some of the lessons from the Cold War that can be applied to our competition with China?
I'm glad you asked that because I think as we are leaning forward towards looking at how we re-optimize the Department of the Air Force, and in my case, the United States Air Force. There are some lessons to be learned and some that you don't necessarily need to take with you. But the one thing that strikes me was the focus. There was a singular focus, understanding, a more deep understanding of not only their tactics, techniques, and procedures, but the things that were happening geostrategically as well. And as a lieutenant, you don't pay attention to much except for the flying, but being over there, in Germany, and having to get specially certified and qualified to fly to Berlin. I was a Berlin corridor qualified pilot, and there weren't many of us around. And so understanding that you were in a time where if you strayed to the left or the right of those corridors, you were in East German airspace and you were subject to whatever they decided to do that day. So you had this sense of there was something just on the horizon that you had to watch out for all the time. And I think I haven't had that sense since that time until recently, where we really need to reinvigorate that focus. But I think that singular focus on competitor/adversary who is targeting you is something that I think is a lesson we need to sort of get back into.
Before I go on to the next question about that, I just have to ask, any interesting experiences while flying along that corridor?
Okay, here's one that many people don't know. It wasn't so much flying along the corridor, but it was when we were taking Helmut Kohl, his entourage, in and out. This is right towards the end while the Berlin corridor was still active, but before the wall came down. And weather was terrible. It was terrible at Tempelhof Airport there in Berlin. And we flew in there several times. And when you flew in, you had to plan on being able to fly, do a missed approach, and get all the way back out. Well, we flew in with his entourage. We could not get in because the weather was low. And when we came back out, we realized that because we had been asked to try several times to land, as a young aircraft commander, I didn't check my fuel as much. And so we barely got out of there and almost tried to take a shortcut just to make it to a landing spot in West Germany. So it was that fear, though. You knew that you felt like it was a hard stop between the left and right limits of that corridor. But that was as close as I came to get a little bit nervous about the East Germans paying attention to my aircraft specifically.
You mentioned, and I really liked your concise message to airmen. I think it was very well crafted, and something that you just said earlier about lieutenants and understanding what's happening in the world, because you touch a lot on education, learning, training, modernizing that. I think you write, technology to improve information absorption and application, tailoring training to individual airmen, learner-centric training and education. I think Lieutenant General Robinson down at ATC is doing a fantastic job, as is Lieutenant General Tullis at AU on these issues. And I know they've been moving forward on this. But what more remains to be done over the next few years?
I think we're just starting to break squelch on that. I think we have so much more to do because the possibilities are out there. And I see the future through the eyes of my kids, obviously. And I was just awestruck when I saw the Khan Academy when it was in its very early stages, a couple decades ago. And this idea of flipping the entire educational paradigm on its head, because the way that, we've traditionally been taught is one teacher, several students. And within that, you have one chance to get the lecture. And maybe a third of the students get it and they're right in there in sync with the teacher. A third of the students already got it and they're bored. And another third are never going to get it within that. Now, flipping that around and making sure that you can optimize for that particular student's type of learning, to me, that's the next level of education. And why it matters as a chief of staff of the Air Force is that is optimizing human performance. If we understand some people are visual learners, some people are oral learners, and if we know how to optimize for that individual type, everyone gets trained faster. So I think the next step is to be able to catalog and understand sort of the personas and then be able to individualize for each of those. If we could do that across our entire force, imagine how much faster and how much better trained we would have all of our aviators and non-aviators, all the airmen across the board for their technical or non-technical skills. We'd have a better Air Force. But that starts with getting the data, understanding the data, being able to track the data. It's about data.
Totally agree with you, needless to say. But there's a lot of great technologies out there too, especially for more technical training, whether it comes to augmented reality for pilots or simulations, of course. Where would you like to see the Air Force advance on these technology areas and adoption? And as you know, reading the National Defense Industrial Strategy that just came out, the government isn't always the easiest customer to work with. And so you have these really innovative companies out there, small, medium-sized, large, that are a little cautious about working with the government. So this complexity of working with the government and the need for these technologies, I'd love to hear you comment on that.
But I tell you, you struck on such an important point, because we are finding that where most of the innovation and where most of the speed of technological development is happening is in small startups and these very unique entrepreneurial entities that just don't have the same business model as the U.S. government. And I think in the Air Force, we've made some headway on the left side of it, with AFWorks and having really leveraging some of the authorities that Congress gave us with SBIRs and these other small business pieces. But it's getting from there. Everyone's heard about the old Valley of Death, but it's true. And I think we're continuing to progress, I hope, in a way that can, when I say the Valley of Death, people act like people can't get across it. Well, someone at the other end of that valley needs to be pulling you across and understanding what that is. And I think when you have some of these propositions, or the legislative propositions that was just approved in the last NDAA by Secretary Kendall about the sort of fast start, it allows you to take advantage and have the resources available when the actual capability starts to present itself, rather than having to put it into the budget process and it takes 2 years, et cetera, et cetera. We do have to understand that we are different from a large company in that we have a different profit motive. We have a different governance structure. Our board of directors are elected by the people, and so there's more of an oversight. So some of that is cumbersome, but that's not an excuse, because the 21st century, people say you need a bureaucracy because it keeps you from making bad decisions fast. Well, it keeps you from making all decisions fast sometimes. So I think this ability to leverage that technology and have some more flexibility with how we might be able to extend resources to those more maturing capabilities and not just have to rely on the big primes. I think that's going to be a key to our ability to move faster in the future.
Reading that message to airmen that I referenced earlier, there's a lot of, I would say, continuity between General Brown's vision and what you're trying to execute on. You use the term follow through, and you detail, all these different things that we could talk more about later. But I'd like to give our listeners a view inside your head of what you were thinking when you decided that was the way you wanted to communicate it and that was the way you wanted to lead the Air Force.
When I thought about, when they said I was being considered for this job and what I would do and what my approach would be, I did think about that. I thought, well, you know what? I don't really have an accelerate, change, or lose message. And I started thinking that I really have been in the strategy and policy business since 2013, when General Welsh brought me in to be his chief strategist. And I love the phrase he said. He said, we need to stop orbiting around the flame of the palm and start thinking strategically. And so he brought me in, and I worked as his chief strategist.
That's a great, I'm stealing that, by the way.
I love it. And so the document that he and I iterated when we wrote was called A Call to the Future. And it was sort of a vision statement for the U.S. Air Force. And if you look at that document today, you'd still recognize some of those themes about one of the biggest challenges is our ability to adapt and respond faster than the adversary. The next year, I and my team, we wrote the Air Force Future Operating Concept. 2014, it was 2014, 2015. And if you look in there you would recognize things like collaborative combat aircraft, things like proliferated LEO orbit for things like human machine teaming, advanced manufacturing. So those things have been there for a while. And I feel like there's been so many good ideas that have built off each other. The last thing that anybody needs is a new set of something else that's pretty cool to do. I felt like the airmen are ready to implement these things. And let's see if they work. Let's see how they work. Because I do believe they were the right ideas. So rather than coming up with something new that the institution feels like it has to rally around, we're sort of really rallying around the shoulders of giants upon which we stand, because those ideas have been out there and matured. Now it's time, because we're out of time with the pacing challenge. Now it's time to put those into action. I think that's something that people can associate themselves with, and they don't have to learn something new. They just have to follow through with the things we've already learned.
Contested logistics, big focus of the Air Force now for years. I firmly believe, and I'm confident that you agree, that without a Navy and Air Force that can sustain forces in the Indo-Pacific, the vast stretches of the Indo-Pacific, we just won't even get to the fight, much less stay in the fight. What are you working on? What is the Air Force working on to realize that?
I love the way you phrase it, because it is the vast distance of the Indo-Pacific. But you know what? It's not just the distance, because we can go vast distances. We have a great air mobility fleet. The problem is it's contested. And the way that we built that mobility fleet, and we built our Air Force largely, built in the Cold War and in the unipolar moment of the 90s is where some of these were generated. There was this assumption of how we would fight and that we would project power from sanctuary of some sort. And we would be able to move those logistics. It was more of just a math problem. How much do we need? How many folks? And, what support do they need? But now it's not just the distance. It's the fact that you're being threatened all along the way. And I think that is something where we've had to adapt the most, and we need to continue to adapt the most because it has all sorts of second and third order effects. We didn't think as hard in the last 20, 30 years about needing to lower our logistics footprint. Why? Well, because it was sanctuary. And so you could have a weapon system and then you could design the support equipment around it, knowing that you can get that support equipment to wherever you're going to launch it from. But if that place where you're going to launch from it is contested, you may not be able to return to that place, or you may not be able to generate combat power from there. So when we had a platform-centric construct, you would build a weapon system, an F-16, F-15, whatever the case may be, and you would design the support around it. And you would say, so this is, I need to take on fuel. So this is the way I'm going to refuel the aircraft. So this is the connectors that I have to have for this aircraft, et cetera, et cetera. We can't do that anymore because we need to be able to have more universal systems upon which the platforms connect. So that's where it is in our weapon system development. But in our scheme of maneuver, we have to think about being lighter, being able to move equipment there less detected or more agilely, which is why we call it agile combat support or agile combat employment. But in order to do that, we have to have exquisite and reliable communications. Because if things are moving so fast and it's so complex, you need to know where the next piece of logistics that you need is going to be. And that may change from where it was when you took off. So it's not just the distance, which is tough enough as it is, but it's understanding, having that situational awareness of knowing where that next piece of kit that you need is, that next munition, that next set of fuel. And that, I think, is where we have our C3 battle management and those sort of things are necessary to be able to work at that much speed and complexity.
What's air-to-air refueling look like in a contested environment?
Tough. I will tell you, we need to look at that, and that's why this looking into next generation air refueling system, there's some work being done on that, but there are some physics things you need to overcome when it comes to aircraft signatures and the like. And so, again, in the meantime, that's where having great situational awareness, if you can't necessarily have your signature be reduced to where they can't see you, then you at least try and go to the spots where they're not looking. And so that's one, and you don't know where that is unless you have better communications across the entire Air Force. So looking into some of those things is what we're doing, trying to adapt our current air refueling fleet as we're looking towards the next generation air refueling system.
As far as China's concerned, something that I'm sure concerns you more than it concerns me, although it does concern me a lot. And resilient basing is something you reference. The mass of missiles that China can have raining down on our air bases across the Indo-Pacific is really concerning. So I don't have a question aside from, do you have a solution to this? Or
I will tell you that this is where, one has to look with some concern and a little admiration for what they did and how they've gone about it. They have looked at what their advantages are playing the home game and the ability to, if you don't have the technology to do the exquisite, which more recently they have been able to do in greater numbers. But if you can win the mass game, you can win the cost curve. There's something to be said for that, which is why we are working harder to make sure we are tougher to find, and to change that cost curve is a challenge. And that's why the agile combat employment is our strongest thing. I think there are some things we're also learning in Ukraine, and the idea of understanding how to adapt what you have more rapidly. We have to think about which of those things actually transport into the Pacific and which things are based on the geography around there. But there are some things that the lower end of the cost curve is actually being effective that we may want to consider.
Spoke with your colleague, General George, Army Chief of Staff, and he has this great line about lessons observed versus lessons learned. And, looking specifically at Ukraine, what do you think about the lessons that we have observed from an Air Force perspective and what still remains to be learned?
I think in general, when you mention lessons observed versus learned, the most difficult thing to do is to look at a situation and take off your cultural glasses and look at it more from just a pure intellectual piece. And because some were saying, first of all, well, this shows you that we need to learn to fight without air superiority because it doesn't matter anymore. And those of us airmen say, well, it seems like if you had the ability to get air superiority, we wouldn't be in this situation. So to me, it actually, and again, that whether that's a cultural lens or an intellectual lens, I do believe that it reinforced the need for air superiority. But the way we conceptualize air superiority, we need to understand that it can no longer be ubiquitous air supremacy for days and weeks on end. It has to be synchronized for the time and place and region and of our choosing. And I think that's the difference, is that air superiority still matters, but it may be for shorter periods of time because it's just unaffordable to do it in longer periods of time. And the other thing is understanding this fusion of all UASs. Now, that may be something that is unique because of the terrain and because the smaller the UAS, the shorter the range, the less in general it might be applicable in the Indo-Pacific, but that's not necessarily true. And so I think there are some things that we need to understand about the low end of the scale. To get better air superiority doesn't always necessarily mean you have to have the next generation fighter. We need that, but we also need ways to do it at the lower end of the cost curve as well.
Air superiority, I often poke my Air Force friends because I say, well, Ukraine shows that you might not have it. I agree with you that Ukraine shows the value of air superiority, to put it mildly. You might not have it. So how do you operate when you don't have air superiority? And the answer often comes back as, well, you need to get air superiority. It's like, well, I get it, but it's not always going to be something we can do. What is the state of thinking in the Air Force about how you do operate if you're not able to obtain air superiority, or how you obtain it for those quick little windows that you just mentioned?
I think the how you obtain it largely through where we're going with our Air Force part of Advanced Battle Management System, ABMS, or as we're calling now C3BM, as part of the larger JADC squared, the JADC 2-piece, the Joint All-Domain Command and Control, which is something that's been talked about and laughed about because it hasn't come to fruition. It's hard. But the idea is that if you can synchronize for a very short period of time, understanding when you can have certain effects. You can synchronize electronic warfare effects, which are happening in Ukraine, synchronize cyber effects, synchronize those kinetic effects. The adversary who is denying you air superiority also can't do so 24/7, 365. They react and respond to those sort of capabilities that we put forward. But if we put them forward in a synchronized and massing that over space and time for a particular purpose, then you do have air superiority for that period of time. But it needs to be integrated with a joint scheme of maneuver. Otherwise, it's just air superiority for fun. But if you are doing it in conjunction with other joint maneuver, it's for a shorter period of time, but you can be very effective during that time.
You haven't been in the job for that long, but how is and implementation on combat collaborative aircraft advanced? And if you could, for our listeners who are not aware of the concept, if you give the 101 version of what that is.
Yes, and thank you for that, because I'll tell you, I am all in on the collaborative combat aircraft philosophy, and I can talk about that in a minute why. But the idea of being able to mass effects contested environment now without a collaborative combat aircraft, it requires substantial number of our most modern aircraft, which are also our most expensive aircraft. They're most capable, but they're also most expensive. And the idea, as you mentioned before, we're going against a nation who is building sophistication, but also just building mass. And in order to match that mass with mass, we are on the wrong side of the curve. And so the idea behind collaborative combat aircraft is an advancement in human-machine teaming. And instead of having, for example, a 4-ship of F-35s have to go forward for an offensive counter-air mission, what if you had one with a few of these less expensive, and that's a key, it's affordable mass that it offers you. The ability for the crewed platform to be able to quarterback these other combat aircraft that are flying the mission with him or her. If you do that, you're able to have similar effects at a much lower price point, if you will, less risk to life and at less a lower dollar point, because we are designing these specifically to be a fraction of the cost. Now, to me, the other reason I think that collaborative combat aircraft is so important, it's really our first foray into the mainstream of the United States Air Force on human-machine teaming. And I do believe, as the changing character of war really privileges speed and privileges agility and resilience, the ability to have situational awareness and act faster than the other guy is going to be key. And that's where this human-machine teaming can let some of the work that machines can do better with fewer errors, let them do it, and let the humans stick to the decision-making, the more complexity that's required. And I think the CCAs are allowing us to do both, affordable mass and really lean into human-machine teaming.
Whenever I get a general flag officer or senior leader on the show, I tend to ask about a specific book, and it's called Cathal Nolan's Allure of Battle. And it's fine if you haven't read it. The basic argument is historically wars between major powers that go on a long time are decided not by the outcomes of specific battles, but by which country can stay in the fight the longest, materially, personnel, financially, political will, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, that's not all up to the services to decide. Do you worry that we might be thinking too much about the first few weeks of the war rather than the first few years of a war?
I think that it's a complexity that we need to focus on as well. Because if we only think about the first few weeks and the adversary thinks about the fourth week, then they won by a week. I think largely that is a question for us to be able to communicate, or a conversation for us to have with Congress and with the industrial base to understand how one can do that. I think it's flawed in some ways to wrap the blanket around us of saying we are the arsenal of democracy, and in World War II we did that. Well, that's a little bit of a misunderstanding of history as well, how long it took to gin that up, but also the level of industrial age manufacturing that went into that versus the more exquisite we develop our current capabilities actually doesn't bode well for a long attrition war. This is another reason for these low-cost, attritable capabilities that we might be able to manufacture at greater scale more rapidly. Because if we're going to go beyond the few weeks, we have to have an industrial base that's primed and ready to do that. And the first 3 or 4 weeks of the battle is where we do expend a lot of what we have in our current capacity. And so recognizing that, we have to understand how to not only be able to get to that next phase where we can continue the industrial base production of those capabilities required, but that we can also convince the adversary that that's not a good idea either, because the adversary also has those complications to think about.
What's a book that has meant a lot to you at some point in your life?
I wish I was a great avid reader of lots of books. I'll tell you, the 1 year that I read most books in my life was when I was at the School of Advanced Air Power Studies a long, long time ago. And I will tell you that this is a way of avoiding the question. But I will tell you that there a couple hundred pages a night you're expected to read them. I went to the School of Advanced Air Power Studies thinking that I was going to come out there a good air power strategist and really an expert in air power theory. Tell you, I did learn a lot. I think not all of it stuck with me, but I did learn a lot. I will tell you what SAS did for me, though. It taught me how to be a critical thinker and to understand how to make an argument. And it was because I was there with my fellow 21 classmates, and every day you'd show up for intellectual combat, and some day you'd go out feeling like King Kong, and the other day you just stick your tail between your legs because you weren't nearly as smart as you thought. So I would say the mass of those helped you understand how to read, look at concepts, try and find the flaws with them, and then find the flaws in your own argument and be able to do more critical thinking. When it comes to a single book, I really enjoyed George Marshall biography. And for this reason, some leaders are staff officers. And he was a commander, but he was most famous for what he did there and the ability. There are some leadership skills that you need is to be a fantastic staff officer. And some would say he was perhaps one of the most important generals in the World War II and post-World War II era. And yet, like the very famous, bat leaders like Eisenhower and Patton and such, he was really doing a lot more of that staff work and fighting a different war in a different AOR. But the leadership skills, the organizational skills required, the patience, the sort of emotional ups and downs that he had, I think are something to be admired. And it just shows me that the message that stuck with me was every part of the mission is important. And if you don't get the staff work right, then the combat doesn't go well either.
I like that recommendation, and it makes me think of something you said earlier in the conversation about the leader you had at the Air Force Academy who saw something in you. And of course, without Marshall, there would be no Eisenhower. He saw something in him that he might have not seen in himself either. A lot of airmen listen to our podcast. I think about half our audience are military. What would you say to those young airmen particularly, or maybe people thinking about joining the Air Force, that you really want them to hear directly from you?
Thank you for that, because I think there's a very important message out there. I think that, first of all, the environment that we're in, which is complex. It's a complex environment. There are distractions. There are reasons to doubt one thing or another. But I will tell you that I see the world through the eyes of my kids, and my kids are 21, and 20. And I think sometimes this sort of Generation Z gets a bad rap about, well, they're not focused, and they only care about their phones, and they're influencers on this or that. I don't see that. I see that, that's a bunch of old crotchety people who want to tell young people to get off their lawn. That's what they say. But to me, it's a different experience that they've had. But I do believe that the great Americans who raise their right hand and say they'd like to come into the United States Air Force or any of the services, they really do want to matter. They want to do something that's important. They want to live a life of purpose. They want to know why, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it's a different motivation, but it's still there. And when we look back through history, see the times that were the historical moments, but what we don't pay as much attention to is the time that precedes that. And to me, that's the time of consequence. Whatever happened, I've talked about when came up, the Berlin Wall came down when I was a young lieutenant. Well, what happened that brought that on? That was the time of consequence. What happened before the big event? You don't often see it, but that's what really matters. And so what these airmen that are coming into our service right now do matters, because we see that there are dark clouds on the horizon. We see that there is a pacing challenge that is laser focused on us and our way of war, because they want to perhaps disrupt the international order for our way of life. So the dark clouds are on the horizon, but not every dark cloud becomes a storm. Future's interactive. What we do will impact the future. And so these Americans who come and join our force, my first thing is, congratulations, you made the team, a winning team, and we're going to treat you as such. But we also have to understand that this team has a very, very important purpose. And whether we may not see it right now today, if we don't do everything we can today, that tomorrow is going to look back at us and ask why. And so we are in a time of consequence. And so the airmen that are out there, doing the grind day to day, I feel like I owe them the promise of ensuring that our leadership continues to give them what they need, give them the guidance and the focus that they need, so they can fulfill the purpose that I think they came into the Air Force to do.
Good. I as an elder millennial, I'm just happy to see another generation finally get picked on. But one of the issues that all the services have struggled with, all the Air Force does better than most, I think, is retention, and particularly because, it is a purpose-filled career in life, but it's also a very challenging one, particularly because you end up in places you might not necessarily want to live for longer than you'd like, or your family ends up divided, particularly if you have a spouse who's also a service member. What is the Air Force doing to retain the family better and provide that work-life balance a bit better?
It is a nonstop endeavor, because there will always be those tensions. And I think that we do ask families of service members, along with the service members, to sacrifice more than they might be doing if they weren't in the military. So I think there are the tangible things. We continue to advocate for good housing, safe housing, affordable health care, all those sort of things, spousal employment, to make sure the family can also see themselves as part of not only the Air Force mission, but continue to see themselves in the pursuit of their own endeavors as well. And I think that's important. Those will always be there. They'll always be challenging, because we're always balancing around, on the one end, we want to have the best steely-eyed warriors with the absolute best equipment, but we don't want them living in squalor. On the other end, we don't want to have them absolutely living in a lap of luxury, but then send them into combat with bats and sticks. There is that balance of trying to do both, and that's always going to be there. But the intangible that I want to continue to focus on, in addition to that, not in lieu of that, because it's a constant struggle that we need to keep making progress on, is having them reinforce that we get this sense of purpose. If you have a sense of mission, this idea that service and sacrifice, not a burden to be pitied, it is a commitment that should be honored. and that should be celebrated. And to do that, I think if you sort of flip the script on that and understand that's how we see it. Congratulations, you made the team, and I'm going to honor your sacrifice by giving you this sense of purpose, doing whatever we can on the material side, but on the non-material side, just letting you know every day you're on the team and you're valued. I think that's as much as we can do until the money comes raining down, and I don't think it will, because Congress has a tough job to do with all the other priorities. But I think that, in addition to the tangible, is the difference maker.
Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so very much for having me. It was great.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the War on the Rocks podcast. Don't forget to check out our membership program at warontherocks.com/membership. There's tons of great premium content in there that you can have access to every week. Stay safe and stay healthy.